So I think we're ready to get started. We wanted to give it a couple extra minutes as it has been very busy upstairs with the early voting. I actually just heard that yes, applause. I heard from one of the poll workers that they had more people come and early vote on Saturday than they did for our whole 9 days of primary ballot early voting. So it's a really good, strong turnout. Anyhow, so we're going to get started. My name is Jeff Zay. I'm the Adult Programming Coordinator here at the Port Washington Library. Welcome, everyone. We're very happy to have you here joining us for this excellent event. Real quickly, just make note, there are fire exits at the front and the back of the building. We are really happy to be working with the League of Women Voters again. They have run many successful Meet the Candidates events here. We look forward to continuing to work with them and enjoy all the great work that they do. So to tell you more about the League and tonight's event, I want to introduce Julie Meir and Regina Gouvenier.
To introduce myself to those of you who haven't met me before, I'm Regina Gouvenier, President of the League of Women Voters here in Port Washington. That has it. Will that work? Yeah. Okay, thank you. Okay. I'm introducing myself. I'm Regina Gouvenier, President of the League of Women Voters here in Port Washington and Manhasset. And I'd like to welcome you all tonight to the book discussion that we're planning to have with Neal Simon, who wrote the book, Contract to Unite America, 10 Reforms to Reclaim Our Republic. And we're running this event in conjunction with the Port Washington Public Library, as you see. You probably all know that the League is a nonpartisan organization committed to making democracy work, engaging voters, and improving dialogue among our citizenry. There seems to be so much difficulty in getting our government to work together to pass legislation in the best interests of the voter. Voting matters. Every vote counts, yet many people feel that their vote doesn't count. Why is that? Why is it so difficult to get our government to work together to pass legislation in the best interest of the voter? Civil discourse seems to have disappeared when we speak about political issues. How can we get voters more engaged in the political process so that they feel that their voice and vote really do matter? Tonight, we'll explore these issues. Julie Meir, our Chair of Membership, and Joe Maissel, who has worked tirelessly with our League in electoral systems and also in educating everyone on ranked choice voting, will be moderating this discussion tonight. Joe Maissel has worked actually throughout New York State in educating voters on how ranked choice voting works. And now he will introduce Neal Simon, and he will also be moderating tonight's discussion. And Julie, I'm turning it over to you. Thank you.
I just wanted to say a quick something, and for those of you who know me, you know it's going to be something from the heart. So I think the hardest part of being a citizen, and I've heard now we're turning the word into a verb, so citizening, is to be positive, to try not to lose hope. Because it does seem all the time like you're just wringing your hands and you're saying, this can't be, how can this be, I don't understand, and it's exhausting. So I'm asking that you try really hard to keep your optimism about our democracy, because I feel that when we don't have that, we don't work as hard to encourage others. We don't try to make it work. And I know that sometimes it seems impossible, but the best you can, look into your heart and try to empathize and have hope and know that this world is filled with good people, even if they're on the opposite side of the aisle. And we must learn to engage with everybody. We just have to. There are too many people who are banging at each other. And so just try your best. I can't ask you to promise, but do your best to be hopeful and to certainly keep working at our democracy. Joe?
That's awesome. Rubisha, thank you to everybody for coming out. Neal, it's so great to see you again. Just make sure you're in the right place. We're here to talk about this book, Contract to Unite America, 10 Reforms to Reclaim Our Republic. Again, you've heard my name, Joe Maissel. I just want to walk you through how things are going to go, what the flow is like for this presentation. So I'll do a quick introduction of Neal. Neal will have the chance to talk for a while about the book and about his experiences, and then we will go into a moderated discussion where I have about half a dozen questions prepared for Neal. So we'll do that initially, and then we will open it up to questions from the audience. And when I say open up, we really do want to open it up. Neal, I know, is at his best when he's engaging, talking to people. So we really want to have a town hall style. So please, any questions that come into your mind, please, hold on to them. And then at the end there'll be time. And then after that, Neal will be available to sign. We have over a dozen copies of the book ready to go. And if we run out, you can always sign up to get one that's signed. And just so you know, all proceeds will be going to the League of Women Voters for Washington. So I'll just give a little background. I met Neal some 3 years ago on a bike trip. And on this bike trip, there were a lot of people, but we were encouraged in a way to break off into smaller groups, find our own way sometimes. And that's exactly what happened. So myself and Neal and his wife, my wife, and Leslie, and we were oftentimes on our own. And I noticed something happening while we were in this little group. Very organically and naturally, Neal would take the lead. And not in a pushy way at all, would just naturally go to the front. He would get to the intersection first. He'd look at, we were given a GPS and a map, and he would find the way. So when we got to the intersection, we knew which way to go. We didn't get lost with him. We pointed the way. And so when I knew he was writing a book, and I had the opportunity to read the book. When I read it, I thought, oh, it's the same thing is happening here. He was a natural leader. He, through reason, research, patience, Neal is trying to show us not maybe the way, but a way forward. So I just ask you to please join me in welcoming Neal Simon.
Thank you, Joe. And I think I've been introduced hundreds of times. I've never had that. So I really appreciate that one. That might be my favorite. Thank you, Regina and Julie and the League of Women Voters for hosting this. And thank you to the library and my friend Leslie over there and Keith. It's hard for us to see you, so I don't know if Keith's still here. And Keith, the head of the library, for hosting this. Really, really appreciate it. So I would love this to be a discussion, but I'll kick us off. Just get yourselves thinking a little bit about what it would be like to run for office. This is what I want you guys to start off thinking about. So I met Bob earlier, and he was a computer scientist, and I met Judy, who is a healthcare specialist. So maybe you're a computer scientist, maybe you're a healthcare specialist, maybe you spent your career as a lawyer, as a business person, but you get to this point where you say, listen, I'm ready to serve. I want to help my country, so I'm going to run for Congress. And I want to be in Congress because I think I can do good. And then you start thinking about, all right, what do I need to do to get elected? If you want to be in Congress, you got to get elected. So the first thing you realize is that in 90% of the House districts in this country, 90%, the general election doesn't really matter. So what's going on a week from today doesn't matter. We already know who's going to win 90% of the House races. We already know who's going to win normally about 70 to 75% of the Senate races, because the districts are either locked Republican or they're locked Democrat. Some of that is because we've gerrymandered the districts, but most of it is actually just because of the way we live and the way we behave. So now you look at the district and you say, all right, I live in a district that's either blue or red, so if I want to be elected to Congress, I got to win that primary. So then you start looking at the primary and you're like, okay, if I want to win, who votes in the primary? Well, it turns out only about 20% of people normally vote in a non-presidential year primary, and the people who vote tend to swing to the ideologically extremes. So let's say I live in a district in New York City that's really, really blue, or I live in a district in rural Texas that's really, really red. Not only are very few people voting, they skew very ideologically extreme. So you start thinking, all right, if I want to win this primary, probably the best way for me to do it is to go as far left as possible if I'm in a blue district, or as far right as possible if I'm in one of those red districts. And then you say, all right, if I gotta run, I gotta raise money. And when you run, and I'm happy to talk about this later, money matters a lot. And in ways you don't understand until you run. Those 30-second commercials that we're all getting bombarded with right now that are so annoying, they actually influence us in how we vote. And in order to run those 30-second commercials, you gotta raise a bunch of money. That's really what a lot of it is about. And it turns out when you run for office, as I did, you get these questionnaires from PACs, from money sources. And so let's say you're someone like me. I happen to be a business guy. I spent most of my career in the private sector, and I believe in the private sector and in the job creation and the economic growth that comes out of the business world. At the same time, I happen to think climate change is real, and hey, maybe we should do something about that. Now I get a questionnaire from some pro-business group, and I get a questionnaire from some environmental group, and one wants me to check all on one side of one set of issues, and the other wants me to check all on the other side of the same set of issues. So there's no money for somebody like me. You're gonna be all on one or all on the other, otherwise forget that. So the financial incentive again is pick a team, right? Pick a side, go to the extreme, and that's the way to win that primary. So you kind of look at the districts that you run in, you look at who's voting, you look at where the money is, and a lot of these things just push you one side or the other. And so what happens, a lot of people, they say, well, listen, I'm gonna play the game. I'm just gonna play the game because the country's gonna be better off, my district's gonna be better off when I win, because I'm gonna be such a great congressman. So now you play the game, and you raise the money, and you run as the rabid conservative in the Republican primary, you run as the Democratic socialist in the Democratic primary, and you win, and now you're in office. And you kind of like your job, and you want to get reelected. So the easiest way not to get reelected is to get primary, right? So this thing that used to be a noun, I loved when you said, Regina, about the citizens, we got a citizen, we'll use it as a verb. So the same thing happened with primaries, right? So primaries is now a verb. So you can get primaries. So the easiest way to lose is, so Joe Crowley, who was the third ranking Democrat in the House of Representatives when I ran in 2018, he was up for re-election. And he had been in office for 12 years. He'd been in the House for 12 years, third ranking Democrat. And he ran against the 29-year-old former bartender who had been a Democratic Socialist. And 14,000 people voted in that primary, 14. Like I got 86,000 votes in my race. She got 14,000 votes in the primary, less than 4% of the electorate in that district in Queens that he represented, or I think it's Queens and Brooklyn. And he lost to AOC, and so that's AOC. So whatever you think about AOC, she gained her spot because she got less than 4% of the vote in a primary in a locked Democratic district. So once you're in office, your incentive to stay in office is to continue to feed meat to the party base, right? You have no incentive to compromise, no incentive to collaborate. In fact, if you do cross the aisle, if you do work with the people from the other side, you're probably going to pay the price in your primary for it. And so the incentives are really worked. So sometimes people ask me, well, do we have bad people in government? Is that why it's not working so well? I actually think we have a lot of good people in government. We just have bad incentives. We just have a terrible incentive structure. They have very little reason to do some of the things that Joe was talking about before. So in the book, the subtitle is 10 Reforms to Reclaim Our Republic. So 6 of them are about the way we run elections, a couple are about campaign finance reform, and a couple are about how we govern once people are elected. But they're all designed to change that incentive structure. None of it's in our Constitution. In everything I just said, there's nothing in our Constitution about political primaries. There's nothing in our Constitution about having a winner-take-all type of primary. It's all just the way the system's evolved. A lot of it has been heavily influenced by the leaders of the 2 parties. And so I think we'll get into some of the reforms. A couple of them also, I think it's kind of interesting. We were talking about this before the event. So a couple of the reforms are purely, I think, in reaction to kind of duopolistic behavior. So politics is an industry. There's this book, The Politics Industry, written by a friend of mine, Catherine Gell, and so she talks about it as an industry. And it happens to be a duopoly. And in any other industry, when you have a duopoly, the people who suffer are the customers. Right? Duopolists will naturally do everything they can to prevent competition, and the customers end up getting a worse product. It's kind of what we have in our political industry here. So, and in this industry, so some of the things they've done to prevent competition are what it takes to get on the ballot. So if you want to run against the 2 parties, which I did, I ran as an independent, they make it very difficult even to just get on the ballot. The other thing they've done is they make it very difficult to be included in debates. And the League of Women Voters, I think, has done a phenomenal job of being a nonpartisan, responsible voice in that process. And I actually talk about the League in the chapter about debates in my book. So it's all hard, but none of this is in the Constitution. And the good news is that changes are happening. And we have gotten some of the changes that I talk about in the book in certain places. So Alaska now has a Final 4 election system where they have 1 open primary. So everybody votes in the same primary. There was no Democratic primary, no Republican primary. They have 1 open primary. The top 4 advance to the general election. And then they use ranked choice voting, which is exactly what it sounds like. You rank the candidates. And it completely changes the incentive structure if you're a lawmaker from Alaska. The same system's on the ballot in Nevada next week. You've got Maine that uses ranked choice voting entirely for its federal offices. And there are other reforms that have been implemented in other states around the country. So there's momentum for these types of reforms. It's starting to, a lot of us who have been at this for a few years, it's fun to see the growth of the movement, to see the success of some of the reforms in different places around the country, to see different organizations around the country getting started and growing and getting these things passed. And hopefully it will end up feeling like the early 1900s, where we had the progressive era, when for the first time women could vote, when for the first time you had the direct election of senators, when you had a lot of anti-corruption reforms, and they all kind of happened around the same time and crescendoed into what today we think of as the progressive era. So I'm hoping we're in the dawn of that era, and I will tell you, I wrote the book just to have talks like this, so to get folks like you involved, to get you to care about it, to understand that it's not really supposed to work this way. Our government is not supposed to be a blue team and a red team going to war every day. It's actually supposed to be a group of people working on behalf of the citizens. It's supposed to be people citizening, not fighting every day. So that's really what it's all about. So I'm going to leave that there and see where you'd like to take this, my friend Joe.
I can figure out how to make this work. Am I back? I am. Perfect. So, thank you. right, so I'm actually going to start with a personal question, something I don't know a detailed answer to, so answer as much as you like. But from what I gathered about your career and your background, you're a CEO, retired multiple times, very successful. You could have, as I say, ridden off into the sunset. You could have bought a boat, sailed the seas, maybe you're doing that, played tennis all day, or make some passive investments and never really engage again. So what made you, this stage of your life, want to get into public service of all things?
Well, first, I hate boats. I get seasick, so that part was easy. But maybe, and I have bought a few bicycles, going back to the bicycle thing. But for me, listen, I have 3 kids. They're 24, 22, and 20. And they had the misfortune of growing up in the household where every night at dinner, I bring a topic. You kind of know this about me. I like bringing a topic and just throwing it out there and beating it up a little bit. So sometimes it was, what's investing in gold about, or what's going to happen with the economy. But a lot of times it was things related to public policy. So we talk about immigration, for example. And my kids would say things like, well, Dad, and this is when my kids were like 12, and they'd say, Dad, so why doesn't the government just compromise and have more border security, so we reduce the number of illegal immigrants, but also have a path to citizenship for people who've been here for a while? And it's a great question, right? Go ask our congressman. And so a lot of times it would come down, and by the way, 3 times in the last 15 years there have been proposals to do just that on the Hill, twice killed by one party, once killed by the other party, right? So we're not designed to have compromise like that. So for me, a lot of this was in response to those conversations with my kids and trying to do my own little part in shaping American democracy. I would say a lot of the way I think about this is you kind of got to decide, do you believe we're in the first inning of American democracy or in the later innings? And I think we're in the first inning. I think we're still forming it. And all of us have a responsibility to the citizen, right? We all have a responsibility to play our part in shaping that democracy. And that's what I talk to my kids about. And that really was inspired in a lot of ways by my run for office, and then the book kind of came out of that.
I'm really glad I asked that question. It was a great answer, thank you. I remember a recent article in the Times by Yuval Levin. He was wondering why, just questioning, why are we still governed primarily, especially at the federal level, by baby boomers, and as he said, they're remarkably old. He seemed to think, or was wondering in the article, that Gen Xers, like us, are just not interested in public service. But your experience running for office, and what I read in the book, point to some structural barriers, and you touched on them in your opening, that might help explain why fewer younger and middle-aged people may not even be able to run if they want to. So you talked about that, but specifically, can you share the experience of getting on the ballot, just ballot access in Maryland, what that was like?
So first, I get this question all the time from friends of mine. Why are you running for office? I'm like, well, I just want to help my country. It's like, what's wrong with it? Like, you're crazy, right? And it really shouldn't be that way, right? I mean, it should be accepted that people who want to serve, like, they're doing it for the right intentions. So it is kind of sad that that's the reaction that a lot of people have, isn't it? Like, it really, if you think about it, we shouldn't all react that way. That means something's wrong. And so why don't people who we respect and we want to run? I think a lot of it has to do with what I just described, is that the system begs you to become a partisan warrior. The system, if you really want to be elected, you are pushed really hard to put on a blue jersey or red jersey and carry the weapons. And it starts early. I'll tell you one of the saddest things that I heard during my campaign. During my campaign, I had these young people join the campaign, and that was the best part for me, was I had like 30 full-time interns. They were so passionate about it. So one of them says to me, he says, Mr. Simon, call me Neal. He says, okay, Mr. Simon. And he says, you know, I graduated college a year ago, and I wanted to work for the government. So I went to Capitol Hill, and everyone asked me the same question. And so I couldn't get a job there. It's like, well, I don't get it. What did they ask you? They all said, are you a Democrat or a Republican? Because if you're a Democrat, you can work over here. If you're a Republican, you work over here. He said, and I'm an independent, I just want to help my country. So think of how wrong that is on so many levels. You take these like talented young people and you say, you want to work for the government? Here's the way to do it. You got to become a partisan warrior and fight the other half of the country. I mean, that's really, and then in terms of elected office, it's just worse than that. So the incentive system is so broken, it asks you to behave in an uncivil, unproductive way. So if you're a rational human being, you probably don't do what I did, right? You probably say, yeah, forget that. I don't have anything to do with that. So I think that's part of it. In terms of ballot access, the other part of your question. So in every state in the union, if you want to be on the general election ballot, so you want to be on that ballot upstairs right now, there are basically two ways to do it. You run in a party primary, actually win the Republican primary or the Democratic Party, or you have to get on the ballot, or you can win a minor party nomination. Or if you want to run unaffiliated from the parties, you got to get on as an independent, which is what I did. So in Maryland, we needed 10,000 verified signatures to get on the ballot. So it might sound easy, but for each signature, you need a name, signature, you need an address, and people are really afraid of identity theft. They're kind of reluctant to do that. So it's not as easy as it sounds. But we got 17,000 signatures, and I was on the ballot. 11,000 of the 17,000 were approved. So this is run by the partisan organizations. The reason most are not approved is that if your name is John Smith, but on the voter ID card it says John L. Smith, that's not approved. It's got to match exactly. And so the parties, it's just kind of one way the parties make it very difficult to get on the ballot. In Texas, you need 88,000 signatures. So it's nearly impossible. And in a lot of states, they make it nearly impossible. I don't know the rules in New York, but that's just, Maryland's, the 10,000 is about average, and it probably should be 5,000, and there needs to be some qualification, but that's what it takes to get ballot access.
Thank you. I wish there was more attention paid to that. So I'm glad you brought that up. Now, we brought up, you actually touched on independents or unaffiliated voters. I don't mind saying that I am a lifelong, until very recently for very specific reasons, but I'm a lifelong unaffiliated, proud unaffiliated voter that never found a home in either party. And I've always wanted to live in a state with open primaries, and I'll be perfectly honest, it's one of the reasons I'll be leaving. I plan to leave New York State in the next few years. I'd like to move to a state that has open primaries. Some 40% of voters nationwide are unaffiliated and independent. And at the same time, though, over half of the states in the US, I think 26, have some form of open primaries where unaffiliated voters can participate. So since you advocate for open primaries, talk about the benefits of open primaries, if some that are maybe not self-evident, and what can we do, right, still here in New York, to change to an open system? How can that, is there a path to that for a place like New York?
Right. So my lens on all this stuff is about incentives. Right? That might have something to do with the fact that I ran a few businesses. When you run businesses, you understand how incentives change behaviors. Sometimes you change behaviors in ways we don't even realize we're changing our behavior. Like I can tell you stories about where I changed our compensation structure, and my employees would say, yeah, that's not going to change us. We do all the same things. And then I look at the metrics 3 months later, and their behaviors change. They don't even realize it, but they respond to financial incentives. And the same thing holds true in politics. So that's my lens on a lot of this stuff. So with primaries, basically, I favor any change that will make people running for office have to appeal to a broader electorate. So the worst system is like my state, Maryland. We have a completely closed partisan primary system, which means unless you've registered with that party 2 weeks in advance of the election, you cannot vote in that primary. So Republicans have their primary, Democrats have theirs, independents not allowed to vote in either, and you gotta be registered in advance. Virginia, right next to me, they have an open primary where you show up. The state does not keep track of which party you are registered with. You can say, I'd like the Republican ballot, or I'd like the Democrat ballot, and you vote in whichever you want. There are different gradations, but on the other end of the spectrum is where you have one open primary. Sometimes people call it a jungle primary. And they have that in Alaska, they have it in California, they have it in the state of Washington. And hopefully they'll have it soon in Nevada. And in those states, in Alaska, the top 4 advance, in Nevada will be the top 5. In California and Washington, it's the top 2. It doesn't work quite as well with only 2. But that's a real open primary. So what happens is that it changes the incentive structure. So think about the different, like Lisa Murkowski is a senator from Alaska, right? She's a moderate Republican senator. She is in office and she's not worried about a Republican primary. She's not sitting there every day thinking about the equivalent of AOC to Joe Crowley, right? She's not worried about getting primary because she knows she's going to be in the top 4 in Alaska. In fact, they just had that primary and she was in the top 4. So she now can appeal to the broad electorate. She's thinking, I'm going to be in the top 4 and then I can win the general election in her case, because now they use ranked choice voting, which I know is something, Joe, you're super passionate about. In the general election, she can appeal to moderate Republicans, independents, moderate Democrats, and she's got a path to victory that doesn't depend upon the base of her party. So she has a completely different incentive structure, partially because of the primary system, partially because of that use of ranked choice voting. And you contrast that to Liz Cheney's recent story. So I'll pick someone who lost her primary. So Liz Cheney, she knew what she needed to do to win her primary, right? Her primary was, in this case, a moderate turnout primary, but it's the partisan, ideologically very conservative part of her party showed up in Wyoming. And she was unwilling to play the game, so she ended up losing. She could have won very easily. She could have said 2 things and she would have won her election. So the opening the primaries by including, the next step, if you have a closed primary, you include independents, you're already changing the incentive structure. You start having, you include the other party, allow people to vote wherever they want. Like in Virginia, you change it a little more. You have one big open primary, you change it even more. So that's what it's about to me. And again, none of this is in the Constitution. This is just the way the parties have designed it. In my state, it's the central committees of the 2 parties that have designed this over time. I actually don't know in New York exactly how the process works. Half of the states, it's done through ballot referendums. Half of it, it's done through party control and the party central committees, and I don't know New York State. But whatever you can do to make the primaries include a broader base of voters, you're changing the incentive structure. And the politicians might say, yeah, that's not going to change me, but it changes them. They don't even realize it sometimes. It changes them.
Great. And you've repeated a phrase, that it's not in the Constitution. That's really, it's really important to remember that. There's nothing foundational or fundamental about the way things are working today, right? So thank you for that. I want to move on to something that's in the book. It's actually the one position that you take. It's actually at odds partially with the League of Women Voters. At the national level, the League of Women Voters, U.S. position, are actually against term limits. You support term limits. New York State League of Women Voters actually is also against term limits for legislators. It's specific. Again, I think that you have some great examples in the book from the private sector about why term limits are really beneficial. Can you think of any examples from the public sector where term limits have been implemented and improved voter satisfaction?
Sure. So first of all, I love the League of Women Voters. It's impossible we disagree about anything. But I guess we do. So, and I suppose, yes, honey doesn't work in this case. Listen, first of all, 36 states have term limits on their governors. And I think probably 99% of Americans support that. So then you get 83% of Americans support term limits on our legislators. And I gotta say, when I talked to Americans and during my campaign, I talked to tens of thousands of people, it felt like 99%. Literally, it felt like the only people that were against term limits were the sitting legislators in my state. But let's say there are 17% of people out there that are against it. And importantly, until the early 90s, states started implementing term limits on their federal representatives. And I think we got up to, I forget the number, 18 states that had term limits on their representatives to the US House and to the US Senate. And it was only because of a 5-4 Supreme Court decision that said states are not allowed to set term limits on their federal representatives. It's only because of that that we don't have term limits pretty much around the country. So it's clear that the country wants this, and the only reason we don't have it was that court decision. So my view, and listen, there are reasons why you could be against this. So for example, some people argue, in fact, I was talking to Judy earlier about this, who argues that, what's that, I can't really see. Oh, there you are, yes. Who makes the argument, which is a legitimate one, that if you have term limits on the representatives, then the staffs who have all the power end up governing, basically, and that it's difficult for the representatives to get up to speed quickly enough in only 2 years or 4 years or 6 years. And so we should let them be in there for a long time. There's probably some truth to that. Some people argue that we have term limits. They're called elections, and that if the voters are unhappy, they'll just vote them in. So the reality is that doesn't really happen. You guys know the stats on incumbency. It's something like 95%. There are massive advantages to being an incumbent. Name ID, the ease of raising money. You got to remember, Congress spends half their time raising money. Period. This is not an exaggeration. In the House, it's more than half. In the Senate, it's less than half because they only run every 6 years. But you're a member of the House of Representatives who spends more than half of his time raising money. So the arguments for term limits, I think, are a little more powerful. So sometimes I ask people, well, first you got to ask yourself, if you're okay with term limits on governors, why not on legislators? And a lot of people struggle with that one. But second, would we be better off? So most of our senior leaders in Congress at this point are older. You get your other question. So would we be better off if Chuck Schumer and Mitch McConnell were no longer in the House, no longer in the Senate? Or would we be worse off, right? Pretty much everyone says, yeah, we'd be better off. Because the main thing you learn when you're in Congress for 30 years, you know what you learn? You don't learn a lot about the issues and become experts, and now you're like the most nuanced, brilliant legislator. No. What you learn is how to win partisan wars. This is what we're watching. That's the skill set that people are learning, in my opinion. And so I think we're starved for new blood. I do use a lot of private sector examples because that's my background, where I've watched on a number of the boards where I sit, when new blood comes in, you just see the new energy, the new ideas, and how it impacts an organization. And I think we're starved for that. So the American public supports it. I think it would result in better government. I also think it's an important tool in the arsenal. So sometimes people ask me, well, what's the best reform? What's the silver bullet? Come on, Neal, there's got to be one solution to this whole thing. And unfortunately, there is no one silver bullet, but term limits are more popular on the right for whatever reason. They're wildly popular nationally, but they tend to be a little more popular among Republican legislators than they are among Democratic legislators. Citizens, everybody, almost everyone supports it, right? But the legislators, and some of the other reforms are a little more popular on the left. So I also feel like it at some point could be a useful bargaining chip to get, for example, maybe campaign finance reform done in conjunction with term limits.
All right, so we'll move on to a subject kind of near and dear to my heart. We'll talk about ranked choice voting, but first a shameless plug. As you heard, sorry, that was me. You heard that I chair the Electoral Reform Committee for the League of Women Voters, Port Washington, Manhasset. So first of all, I urge you to join League of Women Voters, Port Washington, Manhasset, please. And also, you'd be welcome on the Electoral Reforms Committee where we work on these issues. So, had to mention that. Now, you once said to me that ranked choice voting maybe, because we were talking about which one's the most important, could be the most crucial of the 10 reforms that you recommend in the book. Now, there were two aspects to this, right, that we can talk about. One, you mentioned getting primary, right, how the Murkowski versus Cheney, you brought that up. That's the perfect example of where ranked choice voting gets us to a center position, essentially, and it provides the right incentives for elected officials to appeal to, broadly to the electorate rather to just one corner, which of course, if Liz Cheney was going to win, she would have had to go completely to the corner of that party. But in addition, ranked choice voting potentially has other benefits, and you talk about this in the book. You talk about paving the way for proportional representation. And so, and proportional representation, ranked choice voting can have a role potentially in eliminating gerrymandering. You talk about that a little bit. One of the reforms is around districts and reform, but it would rely, I believe, on ranked choice voting and proportional representation.
So what Joe's talking about is there's been a proposal on the Hill that I support called the Fair Representation Act. And it's from a congressman in Virginia, Don Beyer. It's from Representative Don Beyer. He's the one who proposed it a few years ago now. And it combines two things. One is ranked choice voting, but the other is having multi-member districts. So now you start off the lower level with the children librarian level, and this is like when you start talking about the Fair Representation Act and multi-member districts, gets slightly more complicated. But the idea is, in his proposal, which I support, is to have congressional districts, rather than right now we have 435 separate House districts, right? Plus 100 senators. 435 districts. You have districts of up to 5 members. So you still have 435 members in the House, but you have a district of up to 5 members. And what happens is, imagine you're a Republican on Long Island, right? I'm not 100% sure about the politics around here, but I'm guessing it's largely blue, right? We're in a New York suburb.
No.
50-50, good.
Let's try New York City.
So let's use New York City.
Staten Island as well as
Yeah.
Brooklyn.
Thank you, Judy. We're going to use New York City. So imagine you're in New York City and you're a Republican. Do you feel represented?
From Staten Island, yes.
Right? So Staten Island, you have Max Rose and Nicole, right, running in that really tight race over there, which is an interesting one. But let's say you're in, this is a tough audience. I gotta be really more specific here. You're in like Queens and Brooklyn, New York City, right? And it's really, really blue, and you're a Republican. You feel very unrepresented. The same way a Democrat or liberal Democrat in rural Texas feels unrepresented. So if you have 5 districts combined into one and you're voting with them together, you're probably going to end up with 3 Democrats, maybe 1 Green Party member, right? And maybe a Republican. And so that person can feel represented. And think about this. I think 2% of the country is libertarian and 2% roughly is Green Party. So you have 435 members of the House. So let's use the whole Congress, 500 members. You should have 10 libertarians and 10 Green Party. Right, we got 0. And so now maybe at least you have a little representation there. And the other thing that happens is people running outside of the 2 parties have a better chance of winning also. So it combines, that bill that was proposed combines this idea of multi-member districts with using ranked choice voting. So you use ranked choice voting in that general election also. And what happens is people feel more represented. There's much more of an incentive to appeal to the middle of the country rather than just the ideological extremes of the 2 parties. So it really would change a lot.
Completely agree. Thank you. So last question from me before we open it up to the audience. One of my favorite aspects of the book is that these 10 things are very concrete. They really are directions. They're a roadmap. And as you know, the League of Women Voters has positions supporting 5 of the 10, formally, as Judy pointed out, really it's 9 out of 10 that the League is really aligned with. So obviously you can get involved with the League of Women Voters, that would be fabulous. But I know that there are other organizations that are doing good work. You mentioned, or you didn't mention Fair Vote, but I know the Fair Representation Act is really pushed by them. But are there other organizations or some organizations that you'd like to highlight? And what would you recommend to somebody who has read your book and then is inspired to take action?
When I started getting involved in this stuff 8, 10 years ago, there were very few organizations and very few people in this movement. And it's like, I love getting this question now because there are a whole bunch. So there's a group called Unite America that is incredible and that funds and directs a lot of these reform initiatives around the country. There's another one called Represent Us that does a lot of organizing of grassroots volunteers in different states for different initiatives. Because a lot of these things are happening state by state, right? They don't happen at the national level. They happen state by state, and a lot of us ultimately end up nationally. There's a group called Issue One that's great on campaign finance reform. American Promise has got momentum, believe it or not, around an amendment for campaign finance reform. Fair Vote, you mentioned, ranked choice voting. So there are a bunch of different organizations. If anyone is interested in stuff specifically for New York, I can find out more. So you just email Joe and tell him to contact me.
Or the League of Women Voters for Washington House.
I do this out of passion, right? So I want folks like you to get involved and care about this stuff, and I'm more than happy to make sure anybody's energies get directed in a constructive way.
Awesome. That's perfect. All right, we're going to open up to questions. Give me a second. I'm going to grab that microphone, turn this one off, and we will take questions.
Joe's a really good cyclist, by the way. You know that about him? No, seriously. So I was proud of him. I was in front of him in his story. I'm sure I believe that. What do you think, Leslie?
I was all the way to the back, so I
How about that? There we go. Neal's also prone to exaggeration, so thank you. You have a question, Leslie?
Sort of a question comment that we discussed at dinner, which is that when I talk to my local representatives here, and I mention ranked choice voting, they don't want to hear about it. They just say, oh no, can't do it. That's gonna, the Republicans are gonna do this and we can't do it. So it's really just actually agreeing with you that there's no incentive there. So these are people that are representing us, but they're actually not incentivized to broaden their appeal to anybody or to represent everybody here. So I don't know what we do about that, but I just wanted to comment.
Well, I'll tell you one thought I have, and this comes from my experience in the private sector where, I don't care what business you're part of, there's a sales function, right? That's a big part of it. And so you learn, you don't sell features, you sell benefits. That's what you learn in the private sector. So sometimes people, they talk about ranked choice voting and the first thing they're doing is, here's how ranked choice voting works. You rank your candidates, you eliminate the bottom one, and they spend 10 minutes explaining how it works. Yeah, forget all that. Nobody cares. Right? This is the way I talk about it is, wouldn't you prefer to have a system that incentivizes elected leaders to actually cooperate and collaborate? That's what ranked choice voting does. Nobody cares how it works. That's my view. And then if the 5% of people that actually want to dig underneath the hood and understand it, you can kind of explain it. But that's what I find most effective to people like, are you happy with the results that we're getting right now? Do you ever wonder why our government always feels like this red versus blue, tribal contest? Like, wouldn't you prefer a system that incentivized people to behave a little differently? Well, that's what ranked choice voting does.
We have another question over here.
So Yeah, back to your point about incentive structures, we said, I said it at the beginning, but there's a catch-22 because the people in power, as were just mentioned there, don't have the incentive to change it, even though the vast majority of people want it. The number of signatures, once you get signatures get on the ballot, the other party just comes in and goes through and they erase 6,000 of your signatures, I'm sure. I've been part of groups that sit there and go through and look, does that thing match with their exact registration? So they fight tooth and nail to not change the structure, but then to add on to that, the thing that I didn't hear here, and as I mentioned to you, I teach kids, the media. But the media, to any kid, is not anything that we understand. It's social media, that's all there is. And when we grew up, there were a few channels, right? Now, we're not talking the same language at all. I'm not talking, half of these kids I'm talking to, they don't know what I'm talking about when I say media, or I mention things. They haven't heard the stories that happened over the weekend that any of the adult teachers are talking about, and we haven't heard anything that they're talking about. And then you've got the group in between. Without incentives for a media, rearrangement, how do we get a message out there anywhere? Because you just watch what happened over the weekend with, Nancy Pelosi's husband. What happened? This happened. No, that happened. And then there was a tweet about it. And nobody knows, right? If you don't have a common agreed upon set of facts, how do you incentivize facts anymore? That's the last part of the question, I guess.
Yeah, huge problem, right? Wouldn't we all love if we all had one common set of shared facts and shared experiences? And it's a huge problem and a really, really hard one. And I've had a lot of conversations with people about this. I'll tell you where I come down on this is that I don't think the answer is to try to regulate our way out of that. I think it's too risky. There are too many freedom of speech, freedom of the press issues there.
Critical consuming of news, but when you have completely different information bubbles,
Yeah.
that changes what researching critical information is.
Mhm.
But my question is, I try to sell, I agree with you, I also have a background where you sell benefits, not features. And ranked choice voting is about incentivizing voters to pick the candidate they want, and if you believe that most voters are moderate X, moderate Y, or they shift on policies, then that will tack a candidate to the middle. It also incentivizes bipartisanship or tripartisanship because you don't get killed for it. But the two others that people really like is that it should cut down on the viciousness of campaigns, and it should improve the representation, women, minorities, young people, various kinds, because they get a platform and a voice so they can be heard and get voted on by various segments. But my question comes in, over the last week, I've noticed in California, I think it's an LA district where it's open primary, 2 Democrats won. They are now running against each other in November, and apparently the viciousness level is so high that physical attacks on each other's supporters is happening. So ranked choice voting, open primaries, and these guys are the same party, for crying out loud.
Right. So Judy raises a few interesting points. So one is, when people think about ranked choice voting, they focus on how you're tabulating votes, and I focus on how that alters behavior. And one of the ways it alters behavior is, let's say Judy and I are running against each other, Leslie and Joe, and we're all running in the same election. Now, somebody's gonna come in 4th place, right? The way ranked choice voting wants is, I want the second choice votes for those people who vote. Let's say Joe comes in 4th. I know it's impossible to imagine, but let's say the three of us come ahead of Joe, and Joe's in 4th place, so I want Joe's 2nd place votes, because I think he's gonna come. So what's my incentive? My incentive now is to be out there campaigning and say, Joe and I agree on a lot of things. Here's where we're different, but here's where we're the same. And I'm gonna be civil, and I'm gonna actually talk about the issues. It totally changes your incentives. In a system where you have winner take all, first past the post voting, that's what they call it. My incentive is to say, Joe is a complete moron who is evil, and you'd be an idiot to vote for him, right? Like, because now I just want as many possible. I can win with 26%. I'm just trying to get the first place, but I want to make sure he doesn't get 26%. Totally changes the incentive structure, not only for how I campaign, but for what I say. I think you were getting at that. You know, in terms of people in California, so California does have an open primary. It's top 2, which with open primaries, I think with top 2 you get this much benefit, and then top 4 and 5 you get this much benefit. So it's like it's almost a totally different system when you
So
only
what
have
you're
top 2.
saying is, if these two guys were not running against each other, if there were 4 in the race, they
If there
would
were-
have to find ways to appeal to more
Yes.
voters.
If there were 4 in the race and they were using ranked choice voting, they wouldn't be doing what they're doing.
I can see that. Could I go with that?
Yeah.
You have another question?
Thank you. So I'm struggling to try to frame this question, so I apologize if it's a bit convoluted. You've been giving examples in congressional races of open primaries and ranked choice voting. And you say that these don't exist within the Constitution, which I appreciate. But I assume that open primaries and ranked choice voting could also be applied to presidential elections. And the thing that I'm wrestling with is I know that there's sort of a movement to bring out this theory, the independent state legislature theory, that's, I guess, working its way up to the Supreme Court. And it's possible that the Supreme Court would recognize this, even though it's not in the Constitution. They may interpret it in such a way that makes it law. And I'm wondering, let's say we had this trifecta occur where more states adopt open primaries, more states adopt ranked choice voting, and the Supreme Court codifies the independent state legislature theory. Do you have any thoughts about what the implications of those 3 things and what the interplay might be?
Yes, you're asking a complicated question that involves congressional races, presidential races, different forms of voting. My book is focused on Congress and why Congress is dysfunctional and polarized and doesn't do what the American people want it to do, which is, hey, work together and do something for us, right? Presidential elections are different. You have the Electoral College, which has its own set of challenges. I'll tell you this, with the Electoral College, I think a lot of the efforts that are made to solve that problem focus on the wrong part of the problem. So you have 2 fundamental problems. One is the one everybody focuses on, which is, why does Wyoming have proportionately more say in who's elected president than California does? That's what everybody focuses on, right? But the real issue, I think, or 95% of the issue, is that it's a winner-take-all system in every state. So California has something like 47 electoral college votes, where Wyoming only has 3. But California's winner-take-all, so there's no incentive to campaign there. There's also no incentive to campaign Wyoming. And so I think that what we need to do there is to just proportionally allocate the Electoral College votes. It wouldn't solve the Wyoming versus California thing, but what it would do is now presidential candidates have an incentive to campaign in every state. They'd actually come to New York, right? You guys are taking it for granted here also.
How would that work? Why?
Because they now, what do you have, 33 Electoral College votes, whatever the number. How many, 27? You have 27 Electoral College votes. Now, rather than 27-0 every 4 years, which we already know, I mean, anyone want to bet me that the 27 Electoral College, they're divided proportionally. So now it might be 15-12, or it might be 20 or 7. So somebody's got an incentive to show up here and campaign around the country. So, because part of our issue right now is presidential elections are determined by somewhere between 7 and 11 states, depending on how you want to count them. And I think that's part of our issue.
Yeah, I wanted to, we've got another question over here. We'll come back Right. We have a crisis of representation. Right? We like to say we have a crisis of polarization, but this crisis is being caused by a bigger crisis, which is a crisis of representation. If I can say, way to summarize that, sorry, for editorializing here.
Neal, it was an excellent presentation. I really enjoyed it. So I have a party problem with the parties, and New York is a difficult state, and I think it's indicative of a lot of places where the parties really control the rule. And so we have no citizen-initiated ballot. We have no citizen ballot initiatives. So it's very difficult to force changes here. And so I'm curious about your solutions around the party, because there are certain states where it is so ingrained that it just doesn't feel like there's an option. I listened to your story about and I'm a person who generally votes with one party, but I have real issues with it as a democracy champion, really significant issues. And I listened to your story about I know they do it with the signatures, I know they both do it with the redistricting, which is an issue I work on a lot. How do we, I sometimes think is the third party the answer? Is there a path forward for a viable third party? How do you break the lock of the parties who, in our state, also many times decide who's going to be on the ballot? The money question runs through the parties, right? It's the candidates they get behind, it's the people that they push off, it is their complete lockstep control on both sides of the process. And in my state, it's, Democrats do it more just because they can. Right. How do you break that? Because to me, that is when you talked about the red shirt, blue shirt, I totally identified with that. How do you break down a system that, as you said, has a whole industry built around it? A whole way of fighting. So any suggestions around that are greatly appreciated.
Sure. So when I was running, I had this 23-year-old guy who was an accountant. So the blue shirt, red shirt thing, I didn't coin this. This kid coined it. He says, my generation doesn't understand why our government is a red team and a blue team fighting against each other. Why isn't it all just red, white, and blue? I was like, can I borrow that? That's really good. So, that's who coined it. When I ran in 2018, and I started thinking about it a couple years earlier, and I was endorsed by a group called No Labels and a group called Unite America and a few other groups. And at that time, many of us felt like the answer to our problems was, hey, let's get some moderate independents elected. So I ran, there were 5 of us running around the country that were endorsed by this group, including the incumbent governor of Alaska, who had already won as an independent. And that was our vision. So our main conclusion from 2018 is that it's basically impossible. So given the way elections are run in 47 or 48 states, including New York, it's basically impossible. So, for example, right now, I was on the board of this thing called the Renew America movement, and they merged with the Serve America movement and the Forward Party, right, Andrew Yang's thing. And they're putting a lot of effort into creating a third force in American politics. This is Andrew Yang and a guy named Miles Taylor, who was the anonymous leaker in Trump's cabinet, and a guy named David Jolly, former member of the House. And they're trying to create a third force in American politics. And I will tell you, me personally, I feel like, I kind of been there. We've tried that. And unless you change the rules, it's impossible. So I agree. Americans starve for this. Joe mentioned before that 40% of Americans identify with no party, right? Identify as independent. For new voters, it's over 50%. This is what gives me hope also. So 18 to 20-year-old voters, when they register to vote, over half of them are registering without a party. They look at this stuff and they think it's all nonsense. It's really? I don't want to be part of this craziness, right? So that gives me hope. The other thing you raised in your question is half of the states are ballot referendum states and half of them are legislative states. And I gather New York is a legislative state. So what that means, so in Nevada, what they're voting on, what the citizens of Nevada are voting directly on a week from today is a constitutional amendment to their state constitution that will change the way people vote. That will bring in this Final Five system. That's what happened in Alaska. It was through a ballot referendum. That's what happened in Maine twice, because the partisans managed to overturn it the first time. In some states, it's got to go through a legislative process, which is, you're right, much more difficult. You got to get the partisans themselves on board. In Nevada, both parties are opposing what's going on, but it's polling comfortably ahead, so I think it will pass. But it's hard.
So look, I want to be mindful of time. Actually, I know you've got to stop at 8:30. Okay, so sorry, you had a chance. One more question, and then I'm so sorry, but we're going to need to go give Neal a chance to sign. So let's.
Let me introduce Bob, the computer scientist.
Name is Bob Bryant. Looking through all of this that we've spoken about, unless we change the...
Bob, speak in the mic.
Oh, looking at all of this threads, unless we change the basic election process and have like a 6-month or a 6-week or an 8-week election cycle, all that this stuff that you've talked about, all it will do will be just deconstruct the two major parties, which, with all of their faults, they have a stabilization process that's been put in place actually from the very start of the country. So I think there's a big risk to put some of these things ahead of election reform. I think if you take the money factor out of it, I think that will go a long way towards other things opening up. Because to me, the primary thing is not the primary. Primary thing is the power that the lobbyists have over our entire system, including the power of the lobbyists that are doing good, far outweighed by the investment clubs and the kind of Twitter, that kind of stuff. Or that's out of control. So that's my opinion.
Yeah, money's a huge part of the problem, absolutely no question. And 2 of the 10 reforms are about regulating the limitless, corrosive amount of money in our politics. And it literally is like you think there are limits, but there's so many ways around the limits, there aren't really limits.
Listen, I see that there are questions, but I do want to make sure that Neal has a chance to sign some books, and have a chance, and it's also part of our fundraiser time. So
I've got my mother has health issues in Florida, and I have a Zoom with my siblings at 8:30 with that. So,
trying to be respectful
so
of
Joe's
that.
trying to be sensitive to that.
And so please talk to Neal at the table and get a book signed and buy one to support League of Women Voters for Washington, Manhasset. Thank you so much, Neal.
Yeah.